Hey now. It's been just about 15 years since I first started using the internet, and if you're a gamer like me, you probably remember the first time you used the internet to look up information about games. Back in the 80s and most of the 90s, we were in the dark about games. We had to rely on print publications that came out monthly for any kind of information, which was usually carefully controlled by the games industry, or secondhand rumors that you heard from people, most of which turned out to be bullshit anyway. Getting on the internet and discovering a flood of information and answers to questions that I always had, it's a feeling I'll never forget. And I have to say, it's a huge part of the reason that I do shows such as Urban Legends of Video Gaming and Clearing Confusion, because I'm now passing that same knowledge down to another generation, and hopefully giving them that same brain buzz. So why did I bring this up? Well, it is relevant. Back in those days, 1997, 1998, the one series that I almost completely obsessed with was The Legend of Zelda. No, this episode is not about Zelda, calm down. Anyway, I remember one of the first things that I did was look up information on a game that, at the time, I knew only as Zelda 64, and only due to a mixture of magazine blurbs and word of mouth. It was then that I discovered the game's actual title, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now keep in mind, this was pre-Wikipedia, it was even pre-Google if you younger folks could imagine that. So it was difficult to find information. You had a host of crappy search engines to go through, and they all gave you this different results, so back in the day, the best way to get information about any game was to go to a fan site. It was on a fan site that I found a link to an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Zelda, as well as Mario, Star Fox, F-Zero, and a bunch of other great games. During this interview, Miyamoto got the usual host of Zelda-related questions, but then one question caught my eye. Most of Nintendo's major franchises at this point had either gotten the 3D treatment on the Nintendo 64 or were announced to get it soon. But the interviewer noticed one in particular was missing, and he asked Miyamoto, what about Metroid? Would we see a Metroid game on the Nintendo 64? Of course, we knew now that we never would, and Miyamoto didn't give a straight answer anyway. He basically said he didn't know. But I remember to this day the original wording of his answer. He said, I'm not in charge of Metroid or Fire Emblem. Now, there's that brain buzz, a Nintendo game that I hadn't even heard of. Thank fuck for the internet. Of course, it was monumentally difficult to find any information about Fire Emblem at the time. Only that it was a strategy game and that none of the entries had been released in America. So I kind of forgot about it. After all, it was just one of those Japanese things that I wouldn't get to play. Later on, I would find out about things such as emulation and fan translations, and I would get to play games like Final Fantasy V for the first time. But Fire Emblem was a name that was just lost in the back of my head. Until a few years later, in early 2002, when I got my hands on a GameCube and a copy of Super Smash Bros. Melee, which featured an unlockable character, Prince Marth, from the Fire Emblem series of games. I thought it was odd that they put in a character that had never been outside of Japan, but there was a bit more to that actually. Another unlockable character was Roy, who was basically a slower but more powerful version of Marth, and also became one of my favorite characters to play as. Roy had never appeared in a video game before. He was literally a character that made his debut in Super Smash Bros. Melee. But the trophy text for the character let you in on a secret. He was the hero of an upcoming Fire Emblem game for Game Boy Advance. What happened here is that due to the success of Advance Wars for the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo wanted to finally bring the Fire Emblem series to international gamers, and including characters from it in Smash Bros., a game that was destined to be a huge hit, was a way to get people hyped up. Although, what's interesting is that the Game Boy Advance game that Roy would appear in, the one that his appearance in Super Smash Bros. Melee was essentially an advertisement for, did not come out in America. Go figure. But more on that later. For now, let's go back to the beginning. Much like the success of Advance Wars outside of Japan led to Fire Emblem being brought out of Japan, the series itself was started also due to the success of the original Famicom Wars. And the two series even share the same developer, the division of Nintendo known as Intelligent Designs. The original game was Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light for the NES, or rather the Famicom, as it was only released in Japan. The game came out in 1990, meaning that its protagonist, Prince Marth, really is one of the true old-school Nintendo characters, older than a lot of the Smash Bros. Melee cast. Although it has a lot in common with Famicom Wars, Fire Emblem is instantly unique in its serious tone, dark storyline, and emphasis on sheer strategy, rather than just getting through by being a higher level than anything else. One thing that became a huge trademark of the series is that if any of your characters die, they're gone for good, and resurrections are very rarely possible. For example, in the original game, only the character Ellis can resurrect a character, and only if she possesses the Om Staff. Fire Emblem's sole re-release was on the Wii Virtual Console in 2009, though this was exclusive to Japan. It had gotten a few remakes, but more on that later. It didn't take long for the game to get a sequel, though not a traditional one. Fire Emblem's Side Story was released in 1992 for the Famicom. Side stories are fairly common in Japanese game series, and in this case it features a different cast of characters on a different continent, with events happening at the same time as the original game, with very little crossing over between the two. It seems a lot of NES or Famicom titles go in drastically different directions for the second installment, and Fire Emblem is no exception, with enough changes that many consider Side Story to be the black sheep of the series. Like the original, Side Story also was released for the Wii Virtual Console in 2009, though both the original and the re-release were exclusive to Japan. The third game also is a bit of a non-traditional sequel. This one appeared on the Super Famicom and was named Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. This was released in 1994, in Japan only. The story is divided into two separate parts, Book 1 and Book 2. Book 1 was a remake of the original game, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, retelling the story of Prince Marth once again. Book 2 is a direct sequel to the original, taking place a few years later. Mystery of the Emblem also got a Japan-only re-release on the Wii Virtual Console in 2006, which is interesting as it predated the Virtual Console release of the original Famicom game. I wonder if anyone in Japan bothered with getting Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light on the Virtual Console when the Super NES version, which also contained its own sequel, was already there. Oh well. Anyway, the sort of chapter storytelling in the series would continue with the next game, Fire Emblem Genealogy of Holy War, which brought the series to a completely new land, with two separate generations in the story with their own cast of characters, taking place well after the story of Marth, and it had 12 distinct chapters to the game. The game was released on the Super Famicom in 1996 and stayed in Japan. It also got a re-release on the Wii Virtual Console in Japan in 2007. The next game in the series is one of those weird BS games. Yeah, not BS as in bullshit, but BS as in broadcast satellite. Basically, you'd get an add-on for the Super Famicom known as the Satelliview, and a special cartridge that would download the game, which would be broadcast at specific times. It was less of a game and more of an event, as game events were time-based and would also happen at specific points during the broadcast, and there wasn't really any practical way to play the games at other times. Anyway, Fire Emblem did get one of these games in 1997, entitled BS Fire Emblem War Chronicles of Achenia. Basically, it's made up out of 4 short campaigns that tell differing stories taking place in the Fire Emblem universe. The 4 chapters that were available were Fall of the Palace, The Red Dragon Knight, Thieves' Gang of Justice, and The Time of Beginning. There really wasn't much gameplay to speak of. It was more of an interactive radio play, complete with streaming voice acting. The point wasn't much more than to get a high score, and each scenario did not have any sort of ending, so really there's no point in placing it anywhere on the timeline. Now, while in America, by the time 1999 came around, the Super NES was pretty much done with, new games at least, and we had moved on to the Nintendo 64. But in Japan, they were still releasing games for the Super Famicom from time to time, especially using the Nintendo Power download service, which let you download games onto a special flashcard type thing that worked with the Super Famicom. One of these late bloomers was the next game in the series, Fire Emblem Thracia 776. Thracia 776 is also an interquel, but in a really odd sort of way. If you're unfamiliar with the term, an interquel is an entry in a series that takes place between 2 previous entries. For example, Street Fighter IV is an interquel, as it takes place after Street Fighter II, but before Street Fighter III. Fire Emblem Thracia 776 is a unique case in that it takes place in the middle of the previous game, Fire Emblem Genealogy of Holy War. As I mentioned, that game had 12 chapters, and the entirety of Thracia 776 takes place at the halfway point between chapters 6 and 7. Of course, this doesn't mean the game is short. It's a full-sized Fire Emblem game, and it actually does contain a few of the locales and characters from Genealogy of Holy War. Unfortunately, Thracia 776 never got any sort of re-release, not even on the Virtual Console, and as it was one of those late-era Super Famicom games available through Nintendo Power download service, it's a rare game, even in Japan. Copies can go for ridiculous prices online. I right now just took a look, and I found a complete boxed version of the game on eBay for $500. The series next popped up on the Game Boy Advance in 2002. Yep, this was the game with Roy, his appearance right after Super Smash Bros. Melee. The game was titled Fire Emblem The Sword of Seals, though some publications have called it Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. Either way, it's really the same thing. The game is also a completely new story with no references to any of the past games, basically also making it a reboot of sorts. Sadly, even after Roy's successful stint as a Smash Brother or whatever, the game stayed in Japan. There's been a lot of conjecture about why the game wasn't localized, and a lot of zany theories. A popular one being that, as Sword of Seals was not as great as the previous games, Nintendo didn't want to start off the series internationally with a weaker title. But honestly, it's not hard to figure out. Fire Emblem Sword of Seals came out in March of 2002 in Japan, only 4 months after Super Smash Bros. Melee, and a scant 3 months after the American release. So it's quite possible that Nintendo felt that people didn't have enough time to get used to the characters and the idea of Fire Emblem. Plus, Super Smash Bros. Melee wasn't released in Europe or Oceania until May, a month after the Sword of Seals. So there you have it. In 2003, however, Sword of Seals got a follow-up on the Game Boy Advance, Fire Emblem The Sword of Flame. This one is a prequel to Sword of Seals, taking place 20 years earlier and starring Roy's father Eliwood. In a lot of ways, it's just another Fire Emblem game, but it's also an incredibly significant game for one reason. It was the first game in the series to be localized. It's known internationally as simply Fire Emblem. The game was released in America later in 2003, Europe and Oceania in 2004. Luckily, the game was a big commercial success, making Fire Emblem an international hit, and it was also a critical success, with many people calling it the best in the series. It didn't take long for a third Game Boy Advance game to come out, and in 2004, Fire Emblem Shining Stones of Holiness and Evil was released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan, and in 2005 it hit North America and Europe under the title Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. Unfortunately, there were some issues, with some calling it a retread of Fire Emblem's side story, and there was a degree of sloppiness. If you've played it and noticed a lot of typos and gameplay bugs, believe it or not, the Japanese version was just as sloppy. It wasn't a localization problem. There just wasn't enough time after the last game to really make this one shine like people expected. Though that doesn't mean that it's a rushed, crappy game, as it got good reviews and was reasonably popular, so don't go thinking that it sucks or anything. In 2011, the game got a re-release for the 3DS Virtual Console in all regions, so go check that out if you have a 3DS. Now, the series had been on the Game Boy Advance for quite a while, and had not been on a console since the Super Famicom, so it was about to return home to consoles with the next game in the series, Fire Emblem Trail of the Blue Flame for the GameCube, released in 2005. The American and European versions came out in the same year under the title Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. This was also the first one that I personally got to play, so it's my own personal introduction to the series. Once again, the game takes place in a new land with a new cast of characters, with no connection to any previous games in the series. This game is also pretty damn fantastic by all accounts, so honestly, if you like strategy games at all, it's a must-own. Next up came a direct sequel to the GameCube title, this time on the Wii, which in Japan is called Fire Emblem The Goddess of Dawn, and internationally it's known as Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. This one came out in Japan and America in 2007, and Europe and Oceania in 2008. Once again, it's a great game, though a lot of people preferred Path of Radiance, but they really do go together. Of course, this is all well and good for American and European fans. We got 2 games on the Game Boy Advance, 1 on the GameCube, and 1 on the Wii. Not bad. But you can't help but feel curious about some of the older ones we missed out on. Well, at least some of that got dispelled by the next game, this time for the DS, Fire Emblem New Shadow Dragons and the Blade of Light, internationally known as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. As you might guess from the title, it was a remake of the original Famicom game, though sadly it did not include the direct sequel that the Super Famicom remake did. There was a few references to it, however. Shadow Dragon was released in Japan and Europe in 2008, and America and Oceania in 2009. Well, that's all well and good, but sadly, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is the most recent game in the series to be localized. Now, remember how the Super Famicom remake of the original game had included a sequel? Well, the sequel also got remade for the DS as Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem Heroes of Light and Shadow, which was released in Japan in 2010. Unfortunately, no international version was ever announced or released, so sadly it seems like we just completely missed out on this one. Interestingly, the game also contained a sort of redux of the BS game as well. Lastly, and this is really recent, in April of this year, 2012, Fire Emblem Awakening was released for the 3DS. Now, as of this video, that was just 2 months ago, and I don't exactly have a lot of information. However, before the Operation Rainfall people could even start to get all worked up, Nintendo announced that the game would indeed be coming to America and Europe. We don't know when, but it is coming. All I do know is that once again it will not be connected to any of the previous games, and that it will have DLC available, such as characters from previous games like Marth, Roy, Leaf, Alm, Micaiah, Alincia, Celise, Ephraim, and Erica. At least those are the ones announced so far. No Ike? Weird. Well, that's the entirety of the Fire Emblem series, but there is one more thing to talk about. Yeah, it's one of those weird things that is just oddly connected. Sometimes a creator or a group of creators leaves a series and company and goes elsewhere and then creates a series very similar to the one that they previously worked on. A lot of times this happens when they're unhappy with not being able to do certain things with the series, so they create another similar game to show off what they wanted to do. Kind of like how the original creators of Guitar Hero created Rock Band, people who worked on Medal of Honor created Call of Duty, and the creator of Ogre Battle created Final Fantasy Tactics. Well, Fire Emblem's creator, Shuzu Kaga, left Intelligent Design and formed his own development studio, TearRing. He also got Miyomi Hirota, who had worked on Thracia 776, to defect along with him. Along with ASCII and published by Enterbrain, 2 companies usually known for RPG Maker engines, they created the game TearRing Saga Utona's Hero Quest, a game so similar to Fire Emblem that Nintendo said, "Da fuck?" and immediately took them to court. Initially, the courts turned down Nintendo, but then they won on appeal, and Enterbrain had to pay them a sum of 76 million yen, though Nintendo was not happy with this decision, as the court ruled that although TearRing was a rip-off, it did not breach copyright, and therefore the game remained in stores and could still be sold. Nintendo launched another appeal, but the ruling of the first appeal was upheld. What's nuts is that in a display of his monstrously huge sack, Shuzu Kaga originally wanted to call the game Emblem Saga. Yeah, I guess someone also has to convince him every day that punching bears in the balls is not a good idea. Anyway, TearRing came out in 2001 for the PlayStation, and only in Japan. Believe it or not, these ballsy mofos actually released a second game, TearRing Saga Berwick Saga, for the PlayStation 2 in 2005. Nuts. Literally. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Clearing Confusion. Join me next week and we'll unravel the mystery of all mysteries. Yes, the Zelda timeline. For years it's plagued us with multiple theories, arguments, and insanity. And then Nintendo gave us the big da fuck when they finally revealed it. We'll talk about that in the final episode.